Nonviolence training seeks to help people develop and improve the skills they need to confront systematic injustice through organized, principled nonviolent action. Using a participatory process, trainings promote the exchange of ideas, information, and strategies through which activists can become more effective at using nonviolent action in their struggles. In the 1930s in the United States, people began to become more interested in the use of nonviolent action. They were inspired, two in particular were inspired by Gandhi's Free India movement. Two white missionaries, Methodist missionaries to be exact, were Ralph Templin and J. Holmes Smith, who were expelled by the British for supporting the independence movement. Upon their expulsion by the British, they returned to the United States and they started the first nonviolent direct action group, which helped workers in Pennsylvania organize for change. In the 1940s, they founded the Harlem Ashram. They lived in Harlem because they regarded racial injustice as America's #1 problem. Early African American residents who stayed at the Harlem Ashram were James Farmer, who eventually became a co-founder for the Congress of Racial Equality, Polly Murray, who was a civil rights activist, a lawyer, and Episcopal priest, and Krishnalal Sridharani, who was a veteran of Gandhi's Salt March, who wrote his thesis on Gandhi's techniques, eventually published A War Without Violence, The Sociology of Gandhi's Satyagraha. This book eventually became foundational for the techniques used for nonviolent action, and the people who stayed at the Harlem Ashram used it to plan and prepare for nonviolent actions and trainings. Many interested in learning how to use nonviolent action in the U.S., particularly to end racial segregation, lived and gathered at the Harlem Ashram, including Bayard Rustin, who became one of the first nonviolence trainers and key strategists for the Civil Rights Movement, and Ruth Reynolds, who went on to do anti-colonialism work in Puerto Rico. In addition to using A War Without Violence, they also used Richard Gregg's The Power of Nonviolence and A.J. Mustee's Nonviolence in an Aggressive World. People who played important roles in future movements gathered at the Harlem Ashram, including A. Philip Randolph, who was the founder and president of the Brotherhood for Sleeping Car Porters and the chief organizer of the 1963 March on Washington, Lulu Peterson Farmer, who played a key role in sustaining CORE, David McReynolds and Jim Peck of War Resisters League, John Swamley and George Hauser of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and Gene Sharp, who wrote The Politics of Nonviolent Action and eventually became a key researcher in the use of nonviolent action around the world. Training in nonviolent direct action began to grow when people recognized the importance of preparing for their action. Some of the organizations that created these training programs were the Congress of Racial Equality, Fellowship of Reconciliation, War Resisters League, and the Quaker groups. All of the earlier actions were directly in opposition to segregation and Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws were a set of rules and customs that were designed to oppress people of color. It forbade them from eating at regular restaurants, from using regular bathrooms, and even using regular water fountains. It didn't take long before the African Americans in America needed to find a way to fight back. Perhaps one of the smallest yet propelling demonstrations at the pre-World War II time was the desegregation of a small Cleveland pool.
So the same year that the Harlem Ashram got started, the Cleveland NAACP decided that they would attempt to desegregate a local swimming pool. They appealed for help, and the Ahimsa Farm, which was started by local Quaker Lee Stern, responded. They created an interracial team, and they went through a process of studying the facts, developing an action plan, and role-playing what might happen. The black youth were dissatisfied with their first attempt at this, feeling that they'd not accomplished what they really set out to do on their own. So after more planning, more preparation, more role play, they tried again. And this time the white youth played much more of a role of support and allies to the black youths. James Farmer reacted to this action by saying, "That's exactly the type of model I think we need to follow." Lee Stern continued to develop nonviolence training and went on to found Alternatives to Violence and Peace Brigades International.
The Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. James Farmer, George Hauser, and Bernice Fisher co-founded CORE in 1942 Bayard Rustin and Howard Thurman were influences and resources that really influenced the civil rights movement and its future leaders. CORE grew out of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR, and relationships and strategies were formed at the Harlem Ashram. It wouldn't take long before CORE made its mark on America through nonviolent direct action.
In Radical Pacifism in Modern America, Marion Mullen writes, CORE organized its campaigns around discipline and deliberation. Always militant, but never reckless or hasty. Marjorie Swan, a young white pacifist who joined Chicago CORE as a charter member, recalled that anytime you did anything, there were certain rules. Nobody could do anything, even picket, without getting the training. CORE's well-disciplined tactics and carefully planned protests were strikingly successful.
Drawing on definitions of Black womanhood that emphasized determination, strength, and self-confidence over genteel frailty and subservience, African American women took the lead in a CORE-inspired series of pickets and sit-ins near Howard University in 1943. The protest began when Juanita Morrow, a Howard undergraduate and correspondence secretary of the university's NAACP Civil Rights Committee, and two other co-eds were denied service at a neighborhood lunch counter and then arrested and carted off to jail. Immediately afterward, a group of predominantly female students, with Morrow at the helm, came together to organize a direct action desegregation campaign. Aided by Pauli Murray, a law student at Howard and an active member of the FOR, the group crafted a strategy for protest that not coincidentally mirrored CORE's direct action effort. The Journey of Reconciliation was the first major national project organized by CORE in 1947. Bayard Rustin and George Hauser organized and trained the participants, 8 Black men and 8 white men, for the first freedom rides. Some of these men worked closely with WRL as staff and in various roles. 2 were core founders of Peacemakers, and several others worked with FOR. Rustin said that he and his comrades had undertaken the journey not only to devise techniques for eliminating Jim Crow and travel, but also as a training ground for similar peaceful projects for employment and in the armed services.
No, you don't have to ride Jim Crow. Go quiet like if you face arrest. NAACP will make a test you don't.
Hauser and Rustin and Wally Nelson, who was a war resister and a fellow participant in the Journey of Reconciliation, helped organize and prepare for these month-long workshops through the 1950s. Here they taught people techniques through workshops that eventually led to the desegregation of a Greyhound bus terminal restaurant, a playground, YMCA coffee shop, and a Methodist building cafeteria.
Role playing is just what it says, playing. We're playing like, just like a kid, we're imagining. And so you put into it, into a role play, many times things that actually don't happen. But I think they serve a value in that to people who are uninitiated, those who have not faced this type of thing. It will give them some type of an idea of maybe what could take place and give them some idea of possible reaction. When I really get down to it, it takes me about, depending upon the situation, from 5 to 10 minutes to really get with it. And after that, I concentrate first on the people who are handling me. What is my attitude towards these people? And immediately I began to see them as human beings, but misled and doing what they think their job's supposed to do. And that's what everybody does, People who go to build these nukes, it's their job to go and do it, and it's a reasonable position, And you got to understand this. If you can understand people going to work every day and working at these plants and making all these devilish things, and you don't think bad of them, I do, about as much, then I cannot think bad of a guy ready to beat my brains out because he's a God, and he said, do this, and I said, well, I can't do it, and he's ready to beat my brains out because I think I have an understanding why he does this.
I didn't see it.
To feel that the situation has been faced and that, this could have happened, or to see the expressions on people's faces and to hear some of the names called and try to see how one would react And I think it might leave some residue there, so that when you do face a situation that's somewhat similar, you might think of maybe what you did or what somebody next to you did as a possibility of what you might try. I find with myself, when I'm able to do this, it's that one has made up her mind that one's going to act a certain way or not act a certain way. And I think when you know in yourself that even if it comes to dying, which is of course the ultimate, you're not going to do it, then that's it for you. You're not, in a sense, you're not worried about it anymore, in one way. And it's that the other people have to worry about it, and very often they will respond. Now, they don't always.
We all know that the Montgomery bus boycott started when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus to let a white person sit down in the front. But it wasn't just a random action. Rosa had been very active with the NAACP, who had sent her to the Highlander Center to participate in the citizenship school trainings led by Septima Clark. This popular education style of leadership was co-developed by the Highlander Center founder, Miles Horton. The bus boycott lasted from December 5th, 1955 to December 20th, 1956. CORE sent trainers to Montgomery during the first month to train people in maintaining their nonviolent stance during the boycott, which was an agreement participants made when signing on to the nonviolence guidelines. Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley advised organizers Martin Luther King Jr. and the Montgomery Improvement Association during the nonviolent campaign. The citizenship schools that started at Highlander became so popular that they could not provide training for all who wanted it. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded in 1957, took on the citizenship schools under the leadership of Dorothy Cotton.
Freedom didn't come after freedom rides, citizenship schools, the fall of Jim Crow, or even pool desegregation. There are many strides to be made to gain full freedom and equality in America. I believe that the Civil Rights Movement really showcases the power of strategic nonviolence.
The Nashville Lunch Counter Sit-In was an incredible story. These students prepared for months, which makes it an even greater story prior to their demonstration. James Lawson, probably one of the most well-respected trainers out there, worked with these students in showing them what might actually happen. One of their biggest ways that they prepared was by role play. Some students would act as the white racists, and others just acted as themselves. In an effort to make it as real as possible, some of the white allies would also act as the racists, and they would yell obscenities at the students and flick cigarette ashes on them. They would pour milk over their heads and even drag them off their stools in order for these students to really understand what is going to happen to them when they demonstrated. Those who went through the trainings became the young organizers and trainers who continued to have an impact of the Civil Rights Movement, including John Lewis, Diane Nash, James Bevel, and Bernard Lafayette, Gloria Johnson, Rodney Power, and Marion Barry. James Lawson continued to train activists and trainers throughout the Civil Rights Movement and for decades. Bernard Lafayette went on to develop the Kingian nonviolence philosophy and training methods.
In 1960, Peacemakers and the Community for Nonviolent Action organized a 16-day training program in New London, Connecticut during Polaris Action's summer that was in opposition to the building of the nuclear submarines. This brought together experienced trainers who were part of those groups, including Bayard Rustin, Wally and Juanita Nelson, and Marjorie Swan. Also in attendance as resource people were Ralph Templin, who had started the Harlem Ashram, and Richard Gregg, who had written The Power of Nonviolent Action. Barbara Deming came up to write an article for The Nation magazine, not expecting to be very impressed by this event, but she stayed for the entire 16 days. In her article, Barbara spoke particularly of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a black minister from Birmingham, Alabama, who had been beaten by the police for his efforts in desegregation. He spoke about the experiments in nonviolent resistance that the civil rights movement was developing. Shuttlesworth was one of the co-founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957, along with Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Bayard Rustin, and Ella Baker. And the purpose of SCLC was to share these methods of nonviolent action that they had developed in the Montgomery bus boycott. This is another example of people working together as allies. This experience profoundly affected Barbara Deming. She went on to write about her experiences in the civil rights movement, in the disarmament movement, and was a critical writer around issues of feminism and nonviolence. She wrote the story about coming to this first training in Revolution and Equilibrium. Participants in the 1964 Mississippi Freedom Summer spent 2 weeks in orientation and training in nonviolent resistance in preparation for them spending a summer in Mississippi helping blacks register to vote. It was during one of these sessions that they got word that Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner had disappeared, yet most of them continued with the training and went on to spend the summer in Mississippi. During the Vietnam War, trainings initially were focused on training marshals for large mobilizations, beginning with the 1967 Pentagon Action. New trainers were young, many were draft resistors, mentored by trainers who had been active in the civil rights and disarmament movements, and Quakers from a growing number of Quaker organizations focused on training. May Day 1971 included 3 days of nonviolent direct action to bring Washington to a halt during the war in Vietnam. Nonviolence training to prepare people to blockade intersections and bridges took place for many, many weeks in advance. 13,500 people were arrested during that action, and they were held in RFK Stadium. The May Day Collective put together a handbook that became a model for handbooks for decades to come. In the early 1970s, weekend trainings that prepared groups to do small actions, doing role plays and strategy development were organized by groups like the Quaker Project on Community Conflict and Carl Zitlow with the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As Carl wrote in A Reflective History of Training for Nonviolent Action in the Civil Rights and Peace Movements, 1942 to 1972, quote, "These trainings can be used for sharing potential action ideas as well as stimulating, energizing, recruiting, and organizing for action."
I've lived all my life in this country. I love every flower and tree. I expect to live here till I'm 90. It's the nukes that must go and...
The first nonviolent direct action against a nuclear power plant took place in August of 1976 when 18 local people went onto the construction site. A month later, 180 people went onto that same site and then planned for a massive occupation in the spring of 1977. The Clamshell Alliance organized a structure, a new model that included nonviolence training for consensus decision-making, which would be made within affinity groups, creating a totally non-hierarchical structure. 2,400 people were trained in mostly 6 to 8 hour trainings in preparation for this action.
On April 30th, 1977, 2,500 people organized by the Clamshell Alliance held a non-violent occupation on the construction site of a nuclear power plant in Seabrook, a small coastal town in New Hampshire. The next day, 1,414 people were arrested and held in National Guard armories for 13 days.
In the training sessions, we had role plays. Role plays are setting up a situation that is a little bit like what might really happen. So there were police in the role plays, there were occupiers, and the police get into being police and the occupiers get into being occupiers. And we set up, here's where the police stand, here's what the occupiers are going to do, and then we say go. And then everyone takes over from there, like everyone acts in their roles. When all that's done, each person gets a chance to talk about what it was like being in that role in the action. So if an occupier did something, the police could say what that felt like being policed. And this way we get a lot of good information about what's effective and what's not effective and what the different people might be feeling in the actual action. It was a real good way to prepare ourselves and have some idea of what could happen.
Late in the fall of 1986 in New York City, the first national call to action for a march on Washington for lesbian and gay rights convened. In a move unprecedented in her story of the gay and lesbian movement, the body adopted nonviolent civil disobedience as an integral part of the planning of the march. When a community can wait no longer for its freedom, the courage emerges for us to take new risks. This handbook comes out of a long tradition of nonviolent direct action handbooks. It pays tribute to the progressive and social change movements that have brought us to where we are today, as well as to the diverse history and struggles of the lesbian and gay movement specifically. It is, therefore, the first handbook of its kind.
What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that Washington never told a lie. I learned that soldiers seldom die. I learned that everybody's free. That's what the teacher said to me, and that's what I learned in school today. That's what I learned in school. What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? What did you learn in school today, dear little boy of mine? I learned that policemen are my friends. I learned that justice never ends. I learned that murderers die for the crimes, even if we make a mistake sometime. And that's what I learned in school